dedicating the shir, continued dedication for the soldiers, that they're successful in their mission, that they return unscathed, and they also bring the hostages back, also unscathed. So, going back to Parashat Vayera, I'm just going to give, ad-libbing here. When Abraham was told to sacrifice his son, he says he got up in the morning of the day he was supposed to do it, saddled his donkey, and took his 2 men with him, and he did it with such enthusiasm and alacrity. And they say that's how we should approach mitzvahs. Do a mitzvah with enthusiasm, not just like Groundhog Day, and try to do it with enthusiasm and with purpose, and do it as quickly as possible in the right way. Then it says here just one thing which may not come across as politically correct. It says I'm going to quote here. I will bless you greatly, Hashem says to Avram, and increase your offspring like the stars of the sky and the sand of the seashore. And it says, I missed that part. 1 second. Okay, so apologies. Okay. I have sworn by my own essence, because you performed this act and did not hold back your only son. But he had other sons. The other son we know was there, went with as an assistant to Avram with Eliezer, his only son. So that should give us chizuk. Yitzhak was his only son, or regarded as such.
Good.
Yeah.
It does give us food for thought.
And I agree with that. I like that comment. I mean, I like that thing in the Torah. That's spot on.
Okay, so let me just tell you where we are. We in the middle of the 113th daf, and there was another incident from where we left off yesterday, where Rav Ashi was going down the road, and when he saw a vine branch in the orchard from which clusters of grapes were hanging, so he said to his attendant, go see. If they are Kathians, bring them. If they are Jews, do not bring them. I'm going to explain a bit of the background now, because Rav Ashi intended that his attendant should actually pay for the grapes. So what difference does it make if it's a Kathian or a Jew? Well, firstly, just to give you a bit of an understanding, is that Rav Ashi was the leader of the Jewish people. How do we know this, Gavin? This was before you joined Rav Schottenstein al Shira. It was in the 36th daf in Aleph, where since we knew that Rav Ashi led the Jewish people, a Jew would be very unlikely to take payment from him for some grapes, especially since it's the equivalent of meeting the president. Lahavdil, if I met Ramaphosa, I'd charge him cost to get some of the tax money to rate us for. But any other president that you've got most karasatov, and you have some form of gratitude, there would certainly not be a case where you'd want to charge. It would be just a privilege to know this person, especially if he was the leader of the Jewish people. So a Jew, since he would unlikely take payment from him for some grapes, leaves a difficulty for Rav Ashi, because if he is given the grapes as a gift and he uses his fame in order to get certain freebies and favors, it's a problem, because it says in Mishlei Proverbs, chapter 15, verse 27, one who hates gifts will live. And it's even in Megillah 28a. So basically, he said if it belongs to a Jew, it's a problem, because I'll just get the grapes for free. But if it belongs to a Kathian, then it's fine. So the Kathian overheard this statement, but he didn't actually understand Rav Ashi's instructions, because he thought that Rav Ashi might not have intended to pay for the grapes, because he said to Rav Ashi, are these grapes of a Katyan permitted without payment? Meaning, how can you be entitled to have them? And Rav Ashi answered him and said, actually, my intent is that it is a Katyan, because we know that you will take the money for produce, which you're entitled to do. Whereas a Jew, feeling a sense of an honor of affection by being visited by the leader of the Jewish people, will not take such money. So this is related to the previous brisa that we discussed about how do you deal with Jewish and non-Jewish nations. This is a further proof that Rav Ashi would intend pay for the produce that he received. So if you look at some of the text that it said earlier on, it's stated according to Shmuel. Remember when we started the 113th daf, the law of the kingdom is the law. And what that was explained at is when you're dealing in a country where they're setting up legitimate courts of law, educational systems, public health care, you have to pay your taxes. If the country is governed correctly and there's proper administrative, judicial, and legislative processes, there's certainly not a problem. The only time that's questionable is when the tax collector or the customs collector is keeping a lot of the money for himself. So Rav approves this principle, and he says you may know this to be true because the collectors we had an issue with, but there's other issues that come up to play where the law of the kingdom is the law. So he says, look, you've got a case where representatives of the king cut down palm trees without the consent of the owners and make bridges with them, and we go across the bridges. So what would happen is that you'd have trees, and think of it like King Arthur Knights of the Round Table. You'd have like 200 knights that come, and they've got axes and hacksaws, etc. And they cut your trees. There's nothing you can do about it. Nothing. The king wants your trees, he takes the trees. So we're saying, isn't that illegal? Because it's your trees. So apparently it's not illegal. It's not even halachically illegal, because that's the kingdom of the law, that they can use your trees, palm trees, to build infrastructure. So how do we know it's halachically allowed? Because if it was treated as stolen property, then even the Rabbonim and the Jewish people would not be allowed to use those bridges, because even if the king did what he wanted and it was considered the kingdom of the law, it might not be halachically considered not stolen because it was against the will of that person. But we're saying here the king, in fact, has a right to do it. In other words, the authorities, and I'm going to explain to you how this is possible, that it doesn't sit badly and it's not repugnant like stolen tax money. So what would happen, guys, is the authorities would confiscate private trees without paying for them and use them in the construction of bridges. Now, the bridges, if you look at the principle, should therefore be treated as stolen property because nobody wants the trees taken against their will, from which it's forbidden to derive any benefit. So if you look in the history of the Goromora, you're never going to have a case where any of the sages ever objected to using the public bridges. And what does that prove? That the government's right to confiscate property is recognized even under Jewish law. So a buyer asks a question on this, and there's a discussion with the buyer and Rava. So Rava is proving that the law of the kingdom is the law. So Rava's proof is challenged by a buyer, because a buyer is saying, look, maybe, perhaps we can use the bridges not because of the law of the kingdom is the law. In other words, it's not because it's the king's property and it can be confiscated and it's moral, but because the owners of the trees despaired of retrieving them. So what does that mean? Because a buyer counters that even if the law of the kingdom is not halachically valid, in other words, it is the country law, but it's not halachically valid, and the trees are considered halachically stolen, the reason why you're permitted to use the bridges is because if the king sends 100 men to axes to chop down the tree, I don't think if you've got 100 men with very sharp axes, you're going to toy with them and argue with them, because they're liable to split you in half like a tree with those axes. So That, according to Abai, is a valid reason. What are we talking about here? There's a concept, Yu'ush, is that if the owner of an article despairs of recovering their property, then Yu'ush combined with a change of ownership, change of domain, means that the person that has acquired it has got ownership. And the government acquired it by dint of the owner's Yu'ush, despair. So that was what Abai is presenting to Rava, because it's the despair aspect, not because it's fair or right or legal. I mean, legal, yes, but not necessarily halachically correct. But Rava's got an excellent defense of his proof, because he says to Abai, were it not for the principle of the law of the kingdom is the law, how would the fact that the owners have despaired allowing us to use the bridges? In other words, let me tell you the two factors here. If somebody really comes on your property and chops down a tree, even if they come with a few thugs and you don't argue at the time, if it's illegal, you can take them to court and get your money back. You might not want to deal with them at the time, but you could do that. So the very fact that it's the law is the reason that the owner of the trees is despairing of recovering it, because it's written into law. So you can't go to court to retrieve your money. Does that make sense, guys? So you're saying that's exactly proof. Also, there's another factor that's missing, because Yu'ush alone, despair alone, does not affect acquisition. It works only in conjunction with the transfer of the stolen object from the robber's domain to another private domain. In other words, if they robbed the trees from him and then the robber sold that item in order to gain cash flow, like he stole a TV from the original owner's house, it's in the robber's house, it would then have to be transferred to another party when he sold the TV, at which it's gone to another domain, or the object would have to have a physical change in the object that it's no longer recognizable, because the pasuk implies that you have to return it in the state at which it was stolen, at which case the robber would have to give the financial equivalent. Not that he gets to keep it, but for sure the government does. But in this case, however, there wasn't a change of domain, because the bridges are built on public land adjoining. It's for the public. It's not owned by a private person. And therefore, a dint of a domicilium change doesn't exist in public land. Now, if there was a physical change in the trees, okay, you could say maybe it's that. They resemble bridges because the wood's been planed, it's been chopped, etc. But unfortunately, people still refer to the timber in the bridges as logs of palm trees. So it also wouldn't help. But either way, it wouldn't help, because the only reason why Yu'ush despair occurs is because it's law. Otherwise, there would be no despair, which is a wonderful retort to Abai. Now, Abai is still pushing forward. He says, look, those that chop down trees do not do as the king said. Okay, and we all know that if the king instructed them in a certain manner and they deviate from it, they lose the agency of the king. In other words, the power of the king's protection, because they deviate from the king's instructions. So what is Abai alluding to? Because the king instructed them, go and cut down trees from all the valleys, meaning don't be punitive to a person that owns the trees in one particular private domicilium, but take trees from a single value which is owned by multiple private individuals. So they're deviating from that, okay? And therefore they don't have the king's authority, because the law of the kingdom requires the burden of supplying trees to be actually spread equally among all the valleys in the district. That's kind of fair, that everybody shares the load, not just the one unfortunate person who they happen to come upon. But in practice, that doesn't work, because the king's emissaries would take all the trees they need from one valley, and therefore, by saying this confiscation surely can't be sanctioned by the law of the kingdom, meaning that was not the king's instruction. So surely you've got legal recourse. And as Rashi said, why then are they allowed to use the bridges that they built? So Rava gives an answer to Abai, and he says, look, the king's emissaries have the same status as the king himself, and it's understood that the king's emissary will not bother to take trees from every valley, certainly not equally, and certainly not exert himself from each and every valley with the logistics to carry it back to the area where the bridge has been built. So what the case is that the people whose trees were confiscated are entitled to reimbursement from the owners of the trees in the other valleys, meaning it's like a consortium. So all of them, you can think of it like all of them take group insurance. That's how insurance works. Everybody puts into the bank account their contributions, and the person whose house burns down gets to collect for the repairs. It's mitigation of risk by mass. Okay, so what they're saying is they know that at a certain point the king's going to come. They have to provide some sort of protection amongst themselves, so they have to develop a consortium of private tree owners, where if one of them gets his trees taken from him, they are entitled to all compensate for his loss. And it's saying if this individual doesn't get reimbursed, they brought about their own loss, according to Rava, because they should have obtained compensation from the owners of the trees in all the other valleys and collect money from them, but they did not do so. Okay, so in other words, he's saying that they only have themselves to blame if they never developed a consortium. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it's an association or partnership to mitigate risk. All right. So Rava then discusses a very similar situation, and he says to a buyer that there may be a situation where one party may be forced to pay the king's taxes on behalf of another. So he's saying, now here you're dealing with the situation more of agriculture, where there's several partners who store their grain in one granary. So they divided the grain amongst themselves, and each of them, except one, had taken a share home. Because what happens is, if they have one storehouse and each of them has got a small amount of grain, you can hire one person as a security guard, one cleaner. You're not duplicating your costs. And therefore, it makes sense if you've got smaller overhead. It's like almost subcontracting overhead elsewhere. I tell you what it's like. It's like you've got an individual business, and you've got a private accounting practice. People often go to business parks where they rent fully furnished offices, where they get a secretary to answer the phone, and when their line is called, it says John Thomas accounting firm, good day, and the trash is collected, and they have one secretary, and according to which light lights up, she answers in that company's name. She takes messages, etc. So you can think of it like that these are small little farmers, they share a granary, and they all took them out except one poor schnook. So then the tax collector arrived at the granary, and finding the produce of only one partner, and Rava said the one remaining partner whose goods are found in the granary pays the king's portion. What does that mean? He pays the entire tax of the produce of all the partners, who must then reimburse him. Okay, so even if the collector is the type who pays the king for the privilege of collecting the king's taxes for himself, in other words, it's not the king's emissaries, but it's a private tax collector that pays the king a service for privatizing the tax collection, the law of the kingdom allows him to take the entire payment from just one of the partners. So the partner is entitled to restitution from the others. So if the tax collector is a Jew, he's permitted under halacha to collect from the one remaining partner. Halacha, mind you, not just the law of the land. Because it's permitted by the law of the kingdom, it doesn't constitute robbery. That's it's difficult to understand, but that's what Rashi says. So since this is permitted, if the tax collector is not a Jew, There is a practical consequence in that the produce that he took from a solitary partner is not stolen, and therefore a Jew may buy it from him. So the only point Rashi is trying to bring across is, if a tax collector that works on behalf of the king privatized the collection is Jewish, a Jew taking from one Jew under these circumstances is considered stolen, and he's got to get reimbursed in cash by the partners. If it's a non-Jew that's collecting the taxes on behalf of the king, then the Jew may take back the actual grain itself, and then the partners have to compensate him financially. It's just giving the option, if it's a non-Jew, that at the end of the day, there can be a case where it's not considered as if he stole it from you. In other words, a halachic questionability, and you can just buy the grain back. It might be a unique sort of sorghum grain that you want back because it's taken you 6 months to grow it and develop it, and it's a particular strain that to you it's worth more than the money. So there's a qualification of the law in that it only applies to a business partner. In other words, each partner owns a portion of the land on which the produce was grown. So he's therefore obligated to pay the land tax on his share of the produce, and even to lay out the payments of his partners, because they're all landowners. But in the case of a sharecropper, he's basically paying for the right to plant and harvest the land. You can think of him like a renter, where he's renting the field, but he has no rights of ownership. So he's not actually obligated to pay the owner's share of the tax who actually owns the valley or the farm. And if it's collected from him, it constitutes robbery by even the law of the land. Now, if the tax collector does seize the sharecropper's portion of the produce, it's stolen property, and you can't buy it from him in case it's been resold. Okay, so that was the second ruling by Rava. There's a third ruling about the collection of taxes from one party to another. And Rava said, property belonging to one resident of a town may be taken as security for the tax debt of another resident of the town, providing that other resident has skipped town. Now, I think that Gavin and I would both have a problem with this, because I know Gavin well, and he generally has that same sorts of sensitivity that even though it's the law, it might not be very moral. So how can it be halachically allowed, if I know Gavin well? But Gavin, apparently it is, because the king's got certain cases. So let me just tell you what the issue is there. And there's got a qualification. What's this qualification? This applies only to the tax land and the head of tax for this year. But as for previous tax years, since the king has been pacified, in other words, the past year has gone, the collector no longer enjoys all the privileges he had in the past year, including the right to take a pledge from one person for the debt of another. So I'm just going to break it down quickly, because in 9 minutes' time, we actually have load shedding. So the tax collector bought the privilege to collect taxes and keep them for himself. But he had to actually pay the king in full by the end of the year, regardless of whether he'd completed the collection. So maybe he buys that right from the king for 100,000 rand, and he can make up to 300,000 or 400,000 rand above that. So as long as the king gets the money himself from the tax collector, whether the tax collector was successful or not, the king's interest then has dissipated. And under the law of the kingdom, only the king, and not somebody collecting in behalf of the king, has the right to pledge one town residence to secure the tax obligation of another who has absconded. So if the king has not been paid in full, he still maintains a vested interest in the collection. And therefore a pledge may be taken. But the following year, when the tax collector is collecting entirely for himself, because he's already paid the king, he may no longer exercise that special privilege at all. That special privilege is only reserved if the king's got some sort of vested interest. But it is kind of unfair that the law of the kingdom provides a tax collector to take an object from one town resident as security for the taxes owned by another resident. That's what I think, but that's the way it is. But it's allowed only if the tax debtor has fled, in which case the collector is not expected to make the effort of searching for him. So he may take a pledge from another resident who will then have to find the runaway in order to retrieve his property. So that's from the Ramon. In the preceding case we learned, guys, by the way, which involves partners, the tax collector may take actual payment from one partner on behalf of the others. But in this situation, where the two town residents are not partners, he may take only the security, and even that's not permitted unless the debtor has fled. So it's kind of difficult because we're not saying you can confiscate the land, but you can take it as security until the neighbor runs around and finds his neighbor overseas, which is unfair, because what if he has to sell his place in order to move towns or needs the cash flow? It's kind of unfair, guys. I don't get it.
Dave, how about this one there? Maybe they will listen to discourage people from leaving because they don't want to leave unfair debt to the neighbors.
I must tell you something. There are people I've known and you know, we're not going to say who, that have no problem screwing their friends over for money.
Yeah, I don't think that's the majority of people. I think it's a more minority.
You know what, Arthur? You only need one person to poop in the swimming pool and everybody gets out.
Yeah, but then you see, it depends how you look, half full, half empty. I come from the direction where I don't think people, you come, everybody's screwing me. So, hey.
Have you had the same experiences that I've had, just as a matter of interest?
Yes. I've been married. You've been married to me for how many years?
Yeah, fair enough, fair enough. All right, so guys, listen. Let me just see where we are in the Gemara. Okay, we've got a little bit of time. So there's a fourth ruling by Rava. Those who fertilize fields for a fee, in other words, you've got people that are paid to build a pen over the field that has to be fertilized, and they enclose their animals in the pen until sufficient dung has been produced. So in other words, the animals are collected for their poop because it's got high nutritional value and nitrogen for the fields for compost. So if they do so within the techum of the city, within the 2,000 amos of a city, that's what it means in terms of size, it's forbidden to buy an animal from them. What's the reason? Because the animals of the people in the city become mixed with their animals. So in other words, one who purchases an animal from them might actually be buying stolen property. But if they fertilize fields outside the techum, it's permitted to buy animals from them. So all we are saying is an animal belonging to a resident of the city is unlikely to stray beyond the techum because it's 2,000 amos. And therefore, if this dung-producing group of animals is producing fertilizer, and these guys are hired to produce fertilizer, bring the animals outside the city, and they want to sell one of the animals, we can assume it's not stolen and there's been a mix-up and we can buy it from them. But the minute they come to do compost collection and fertilization within the city, it's very possible if they're wild animals to get mixed up with others, and then you can't buy it because there's a question as to whether or not it's mixed with stolen or mixed up produce. So there's a qualification by Ravina who said, if the owner of the animal was chasing after them to retrieve it, one is forbidden to buy from them, even if they fertilize fields outside the techum. Okay? Meaning, although we don't know for sure, with certainty, that his claim is true, if he's saying, one of my animals got mixed up with their animals and they haven't given me my animal back, that evidence of that outcry is enough to be cautious, and it suffices to ban the purchase of any of their animals. Okay, let's just see what we've got. We've got a fifth ruling of Rava. Let me have a look. Let's see how long we've got. We've got time, guys. We actually have time until load shedding. So a fifth ruling in the name of Rava, and some say it was Rav Huna proclaimed, those going up from Babylonia to Eretz Israel and those going down from Eretz Israel to Babylonia should know the following law. Okay. And let me just see if it's got a source for the law. It's in the 69th daf of Kedushin. Okay. So what's the law? If a Jew has testimony for Kathian, but was not asked to testify, you know what, guys? I've thought about it. I know we've got 7 minutes left.